Welcome to the Tyler's Place video podcast, a podcast brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction. I'm Maynard Edwards, 33rd degree. Thank you for joining us. There's a fantastic documentary right now on Netflix called Join or Die. If you're a history nerd like I am, you might suppose that Join or Die had something to do with Ben Franklin. Brother Ben in 1754 famously drew a cartoon of a snake cut into several pieces, and it was titled Join or Die. He was urging the British colonies to all band together against the French at the time. But in this case, Join or Die is the plea of two documentary filmmakers who say that if we don't all start taking part in civic organizations like Freemasonry, our country as we know it is in a lot of trouble. And I think that most Freemasons would agree. Co-executive producers and co-directors Pete Davis and Rebecca Davis are a brother and sister team of filmmakers from the Washington, D.C. area who produced this documentary, and it follows the work of Robert Putnam. He's the Harvard professor who wrote the book Bowling Alone that talks about the decline of fraternal and civic organizations beginning in the mid-20th century. Now, if you've never read Bowling Alone, you absolutely need to do yourself a favor and grab a copy of that. But also, make sure you watch this documentary, Join or Die. Again, it's on Netflix right now. When I found out that Rebecca and Pete were from the Washington, D.C. area, I invited them to the House of the Temple to sit down and talk a little bit about the documentary, Join or Die. And to start with, I asked Pete to give us the elevator pitch for the Netflix documentary.
Yep, Join or Die is a film about why you should join a club and why the fate of America depends on it.
I agree.
Yes.
And I know which club.
And specifically, it's about the journey of probably America's leading expert on the history of community in America, who is Robert Putnam, the Harvard social scientist, who has not only studied why community is really important to democracy, he's also studied why community, how community declined over the last 50 years, the amount of people going to club meetings, participating in clubs, and clubs in the broadest sense of the term, fraternal organizations, unions, congregations, political associations, civic associations, neighborhood groups, has declined over the last 50 years, and how we, most importantly, how we can turn it around in the coming century.
So when you guys started working on this, Rebecca, I'll ask you, did you have the idea and then pitch this to a company for production, or did you produce it and then shop it? What was the chicken and egg here?
Yeah, so it was an independently produced documentary. My brother and I started a film production company to make this happen. We had no intention, I think, growing up that we'd ever kind of, be partners. The stars aligned, I think, on this project in particular. At the moment, we were kind of interested in approaching Robert Putnam. That was in 2017. I was working as a news producer for NBC News at that time, full time. And I was covering a lot of these, bowling alone symptoms on the ground. As I was flying out around the country, I was talking to a lot of Americans who felt like things were off in their communities and desiring a chance to not just keep covering the symptoms of that, but kind of, give some, broader trends about what was going on and, a path forward. At that time, in 2017, Pete was about 10 years out of taking Robert Putnam's class. He was a student of Robert Putnam, so he had this personal connection to him. And we heard that Bob was about to retire and thought it was kind of the moment. And I said, to Pete, I think I was home on a family holiday or something. And, we were talking about it and we said, maybe it's time to kind of revisit Robert Putnam's famous work, Bowling Alone, that was coming up on its 20th anniversary in 2020. We thought we might be able to get the film out. For them, we were off by about 4 years.
Something happened that delayed that.
Of course, pandemic hit in the middle. But, I think that ended up bringing these issues of our need for community that much more to the forefront of people's minds.
You open and close on an Oddfellows Lodge, actually, and I do see some Shriners Fezzes in there. Did you specifically speak to any Masonic organizations that may have ended up on the cutting room floor? Because sometimes at this point, Masons, and I get it on our YouTube channel, I get it every day. I call them the tinfoil hat people, are constantly making weird threats and things to us. So sometimes we can be a little like, no cameras. But what about you guys? Did you run into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was an incredible education for us working on this film. We learned, so much more about, the importance of groups like the Masons, along with, so many other organizations that we had never even heard of. But I think what we were looking for, it was probably one of the hardest things to narrow down what groups we would cover, both because there are so many ways that people are still getting together every day in America and bucking these decline trends. That made it difficult. And also, it's really hard to just pick a handful of groups and kind of have them be the representation of community in America. So, I think our hope was, while we couldn't, feature every single fraternal organization, that, at least, we did know we wanted to at least feature one fraternal org that could, ultimately be a stand-in for that.
A few Masonic things that came up in our research that we loved. We're big fans of this book by Theta Skocpol called Diminished Democracy, which is about the decline of federated organizations and how important specifically federated membership organizations are. And, she mentions in that book, the Masons were the template for all the other organizations. You say you thought Join or Die was about Ben Franklin, and it turned out to be about this. We specifically wanted to do a nod to Ben Franklin because if there is a founder that is about civic life, not specifically fighting in a war or specifically designing the Constitution.
Not the soldier statesman that Washington was.
Yes.
Those other guys, yeah.
But about being in the neighborhood, starting groups, starting the first fire department, starting the first library, starting the Junto Club. I bet you all know way more than we do about this, but I bet he learned his art of joining and coming together with his neighbors at his Masonic meetings. So that's a huge part of this.
In the film, there is a discussion about the reason that these organizations have seen decline. Can you talk a little bit about that?
In that section of the film, we were very careful and very mindful of how we did that. Because first off, there is not including Bob. Bob studied this more than almost anyone. If we had a theory of what it is, the one metaphor that we might want to put a scale on is that civic life is an ecosystem. It's all interconnected. The fact that there's a Masonic lodge in a place, and there's a newspaper in a place, and there's meeting spaces in a place, and there's a mayor that cares about civic life, that all contributes to civic life. And you can have an unraveling of civic life one piece at a time, where if the newspaper goes down, or the meeting halls go down, or the Masonic lodge loses members and stops doing its annual events, all of that contributes to ecosystem collapse. And what that's getting at is, it might not be one cause. It might be that a very tender network of civic life is fragile, and if it starts going in one direction, you can have a vicious cycle.
So you remove the bumblebee from the ecosystem,
Yes,
everything else
exactly.
collapses.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. I mean, if your religious organization was running a soup kitchen to feed the people, when they were in between jobs and needed a little extra help, when that religious organization doesn't have membership to run that soup kitchen anymore, you start seeing a lot more folks kind of on the street struggling, and then, snowball effect from there.
Well, and that brings up the question then, can that be reversed? Can we bring the bumblebee? Can we
Yes.
Jurassic Park the bumblebee back to life? So
Absolutely.
if a lodge is flourishing in a community, can that bring a community back?
Absolutely. And I think that's something we get a lot of hope from, because I think, especially with so much of the media we get today being national big stories, I think it can leave a lot of people despairing. And I don't think despair is a good place to move people to action from. But I think the good news about, seeing things from ecosystem collapses, that means you just start planting some seeds.
While we're seeing or we have seen the decline of groups like the Masons, like the Elks, like those traditional churches and things, we're seeing growth in D&D clubs, gamer clubs, more hobby-based type things rather. But you point out with I think it was the anti-slavery women's sewing sewing circle, like it may start out as a sewing circle, but then takes on something else. Now, do you see those as being a replacement for, addition to? I mean, where does that fit into that ecosystem? I
Yeah,
guess?
I think what we wanted to, as we were selecting the 6 community groups to show in the film, we wanted to show something that, was just started in the last couple years, and also a group that was carrying on, a tradition that was, over 100 years old, as the Masons are an incredible example of as well. And I think we need both. We need to, carry on our traditional organizations, because we have a lot to learn from the skills that they have cultivated over these years about how to run a meeting, how to get stuff done.
One of the reasons we cared about saying our opening tagline of the film was, "This is a film about why you should join a club," and not, "This is a film about why you should build community," is because the formal organization of the club is more than community. It's also about empowerment. It's also about being an institution in the town. It's also about federating together and being an institution in the country or in the world. And it's also, and so there are elements that you might get in that you get it, as you know, preach to the choir here to this audience, that you get in the Masons that you don't get in a D&D club. And so, moral formation, deep fraternal brotherhood and sisterhood of like really being there for each other in a deep way.
Intergenerational bonding and mentorship.
Yeah.
My son's a Mason.
Talking about, hey, we're an institution in this town. Is there a problem in this town that we can talk about and how can we contribute to it? I am always encouraging the D&D clubs is you might be the seed of a larger group. Some of these groups, the history of these groups, they start in some very particular hobby and then they grow and become something bigger. And so I always encourage, be really there for each other's members. If you're running a pickleball court league, start being a steward of the pickleball courts, and maybe even go further and be a steward of the parks that the pickleball courts are part of. And you started because you were looking for pickleball partners, and then suddenly you're the steward of all the parks in the town. That's how it starts. What people don't think sometimes with groups is they think we got to keep it exactly the same, and it's like we need to it's like putting an animal that you inherited behind glass. When you put an animal that you inherited behind glass, you check in on it in a year and it's dead. What you do with an animal that you inherit is you have to feed it, you have to know what it wants, you have to have a mix where you have to know what it is. It can't just become anything, but you also have to see what its current needs are, and that's what every new generation is. With this organization, how does being an Oddfellow, how does being a Catholic, how does being a pickleball league member relevant to this group, keeping some of its original mission and spirit while also attending to what the world does as it's changing.
At some point in the history of all of these organizations, the members are at what someone would have been excited to have. Some lodges go, "Oh, we used to have 1,000 members," but there was a time in that lodge's history when they say, "Wow, we've got 100 members."
Yeah, and I think it's something we really found a lot of hope in Bob's work in is and again I think in the media we're looking at things happening day by day, week by week. When you spend time with a university professor, of history and sociology and political science, they're looking at a much, longer view. And so, spending time with Bob's work as he looks back over, one generation, two generations, you see longer trends. And, another thing we find hope is things can change a lot just in one generation. There can really be massive cultural changes. What we experienced over the last half century was a change in one direction, which unfortunately saw a lot of declines. But that means in another generation, if we have kind of a cultural awakening to what's going on and a shift in behavior, it might not take that long to kind of turn things around.
Rebecca Davis and Pete Davis, co-producers, co-directors of Join or Die. It's a documentary streaming now on Netflix. If you're a Freemason, I really think you need to watch this documentary and maybe consider a screening at your lodge. It's one of those things that's sort of must watch for all of us. Pete and Rebecca were kind enough to spend quite a lot of time with us at the House of the Temple, and if you want to hear the complete unedited interview, make sure you check out the full version in the Tyler's Place podcast feed, which is linked above and down below, and really it's available wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search Tyler's Place Podcast. Also, don't forget, do all that great YouTube stuff for us. Thumbs up, subscribe, drop a comment below, and we need your help. We're preserving Masonic history. For $2 a month, you can help us. And the Lost Media Archive. We're preserving 20th century media that is about Freemasonry, and we're going to lose it if we don't start working on it right now. We need your help. Click that link to learn more. I'm Maynard Edwards, 33rd Degree. Thanks for watching the Tyler's Place video podcast as part of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry channel here on YouTube. See you soon.